Hi, I'm Jenny Purcell. I'm from the BVD policy team in Scottish Government. I'm here to give you a bit of an update on the progress that we're making as we get towards the end of our BVD eradication programme. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll tell you a bit about the following topics, following headings. So I'll talk a little bit about where we've come from, let you know where we've got to, where we are now, a little bit on what we've learnt along the way, and where we're going next. So to start off with the history of Scotland's BVD eradication scheme, I think it's really important to emphasise that this is an industry-led scheme. It started due to industry lobbying, and industry was so keen to get an eradication scheme in place that Scottish Government agreed to back it with legislation. The scheme was very much designed to mirror the existing herd health schemes. And so it's very much focused on the BVD status of the breeding herd. And that makes sense in terms of the production of PI calves. They are only going to come from herds where calves are being born. So if we can control BVD in the herds that are producing calves, we can get to the point where BVD is eradicated. So the scheme started as a voluntary programme in 2010. And at that point, the cattle keepers were invited to get a herd state, test their cattle and get a herd status. In 2013, it became compulsory, which meant that those breeding herds had to update their BVD herd status annually. And it's continued in that way with this phased approach, with measures being added on and new rounds of legislation to bring those measures in. That means that the obligations have gradually increased over the course of the scheme. And it also means that the penalties have increased too. You could say that we've moved from a position of just relying on the carrot when herds could voluntarily get their BVD negative badge back in the phase 1 of the scheme, to where we are now in phase 5, where there are a lot more requirements of breeding herds. And there are also more penalties too. For example, the movement restrictions for the not negative herds. To tell you a little bit then about where we are now, I'm going to take you through the last 8 years of BVD eradication in Scotland. So this map shows Scotland divided by county. The colours of the county reflect the BVD prevalence in each county. So the proportion of negative herds. The palest colours are the ones with the lowest number of BVD not negative herds. And the darker the colour, the more not negative herds are in the county. So you can see that we've got dark areas in the southwest of Scotland, where we see the reds and the blacks, and in that northeast corner, where it's oranges and reds. And those are the areas, not surprisingly, with the highest cattle density. So that was the situation back in 2013 when the BVD eradication scheme started. And as you go through the years, what you see, looking at the maps which were produced not quite annually, almost annually, is that the colours fade as we go on. You're seeing less black, less red, even less orange as you come through to the more recent years. The colours are getting paler and paler. The proportion of negative herds is going up. And we've reached the point now when we're around about 90% of breeding herds in Scotland are negative for BVD. The remaining 10% are not negative for various reasons. And I think perhaps the most important message to take away from this sequence of maps is that it shows how engaged Scotland's farmers have been throughout the course of the scheme. We've had this steady improvement. We haven't yet had any reversals, and that's down to the fact that Scotland's farmers are continuing to follow the rules of the scheme and continuing to test their cattle annually. What have we learned through over the course of the scheme? I'll start off by talking about the strengths of Scotland's BVD eradication scheme. And the first thing I'd like to pick up is that we have a choice of test. So we allow cattle keepers to choose between doing serology testing of young stock, which means testing a representative group of young animals for BVD antibodies to test if the herd's been exposed to BVD. Alternatively, if the farmer prefers, he can test every calf born for antibody, and that's suitable. That's more suitable for some herds than others, and this is allowing farmers the choice, the flexibility to fit in with their herd management system, their herd size, and their preferences. I think probably promotes the engagement of the scheme and respects the farmer's own herd management situation. We also, I think, gain an advantage from having serology testing included throughout the life of the scheme, because at some point when we have eradicated BVD, we will want to do surveillance on the national herd, and serology of young stock may well be part of that. So the fact that farmers are already familiar with it is probably going to help us later on in the scheme. The next strength of the scheme is the BVD advisory group. This is the group of industry representatives who lead BVD eradication in Scotland. They monitor the scheme, they monitor progress, and they decide on the next steps. They also try and ensure that every measure we introduce is fair and is practical. The involvement of vets, I think, is an important strength. Vets have been involved in Scotland's BVD eradication scheme since the beginning, principally as advisors to their clients, and also obviously to undertake the blood testing where farmers opt to do that. And it's really important, I think, to have them involved, because when farmers are surveyed, they will very often pick out vets as their most trusted source of advice. So if we can channel the BVD advice through the vets, we can maintain the progress of the scheme and maintain the engagement amongst the clients. We have a purpose-built database, which is paid for by Scottish Government and is free to use. It's a highly functional piece of kit. We use it to keep track of progress of the scheme. The local authorities use it for enforcement, and farmers and vets and livestock markets, for that matter, can use it as a management tool. So it's a highly functional system, and it goes hand in hand with the Scotty ID helpline, which is again funded by Scottish Government, and anyone can phone the helpline to access the database and to learn about the scheme. Really, the helpline represents the friendly face of Scotland's BVD eradication scheme, and that's a very important aspect of a scheme at this, I think, particularly at this stage when we're quite far on towards eradication. The scheme is quite complex. We expect a lot from our farmers. It's really important to have friendly advice available for them. And finally, just to come back to that E word, the engagement of the farmers and their vets is the key to the success of the scheme so far. And that's founded on all of these other strengths and other things besides, but that's the absolutely critical thing that makes the scheme work. And so to move on and talk a little bit about the weaknesses of the scheme, the first thing I'd want to pick up is how complex our scheme is. You'll already have gathered that it's a very nuanced scheme. There's this choice of tests, the fact that it's based on herd status. There are different requirements for people in different stages of BVD control. So it is complicated, and messaging can be challenging, and that makes it hard to operate sometimes. However, it is mitigated by having the helpline, and also having excellent advice coming in from the private vets. Non-breeding herds are probably a weakness of our scheme, principally because Scotland's eradication scheme is focused on the breeding herds. there are very few obligations that the non-breeding herds actually have to comply with. So that leads to something of a two-tier system, and it means that it adds to the complexity, but it also means that the non-breeding herds can put their neighbours at risk if they're bringing animals in from outside Scotland and they're not testing them. Which brings me to the imported animals. And I'm in this context, I'm using imported to mean any animal from outside Scotland. These animals, if they're untested, they might be PIs. We might be inadvertently bringing in PIs. Equally problematic are the Trojan cows. These are the in-calf females who are completely well themselves, are BVD negative themselves, but may be carrying a PI calf. And you won't know that until the calf is born and tested. But until it is tested, it's a potential risk to the scheme. The next weakness is arguably the rate of progress. With this phased approach and the very kind of collaborative, consensual approach that we've taken in Scotland, it has been slow progress, but it's been steady. However, I know that for some farmers, the slow rate of progress is frustrating. And I wanted to take the opportunity to mention enforcement under weaknesses of the scheme, because at first sight, the apparent lack of enforcement, the lack of court cases, could be seen as a weakness of the scheme. But it's important, I think, to bear in mind that BVD enforcement, while it's very important to me, isn't always the first priority for the enforcement agencies. They have so many other things to consider. Whilst I might like the idea of a court case that would bring attention to BVD non-compliance and encourage people to step into line, I know from experience, or I've learned from experience, that good advice from the enforcement officers can actually be very persuasive to non-compliant farmers, and particularly when that advice is in step with what they're hearing from the helpline and from their own vet. And I think I would say that the time I've spent on training the enforcement agencies in BVD and supporting them through some of the enforcement actions that they've taken has been time really well spent. And finally, under weaknesses, I just wanted to mention the alignment with other programs. And that's all. I think that's well recognised. Across the whole of the British Isles, we've all got different BVD eradication programmes, although we're all aiming, obviously, for the same endpoint. But we all have different approaches and we have different IT systems. And it can be difficult then to transfer data, to share personal information, and to link up different IT systems. So although our alignment is, I think I could say at the moment it's patchy, we are working on it and we do recognise it as a priority. So to move on to future plans, I'll just say a few words about what's coming up for us. There will be a phase 6. We don't yet know exactly what's going to be in phase 6. It could be more controls on those Trojan cows. We might want to raise the requirements for the non-breeding herds. We may consider paying farmers to remove their PIs, but all of those things are still to be finalised. They're going to be the topics of discussion for the BVD advisory group over the next 12 months or so. Whatever the content of phase 6 and any subsequent phases after that, it will be subject to public consultation, and ultimately it'll be decided on by the BVD advisory group. Something else we need to consider over the next year or so is, what does eradication actually look like? What level of BVD in Scotland can we take as meaning that BVD is effectively eradicated? It probably won't be zero, but it's going to be a very low prevalence. We may use the definition in the EU Animal Health Regulation, But again, that's something for the BVD advisory group to decide upon, and that I think will be happening over the next year or so. And finally, in terms of future plans, I just wanted to come back to that question of surveillance, because once we have reached the end point of eradication, we'll need to do some sort of national surveillance to demonstrate that we are disease-free. And we don't know yet whether that will take the form of maybe bulk milk testing, possibly sampling at abattoirs. It might be the serology testing of young stock that I mentioned earlier, that would mirror what we currently ask farmers to do in terms of check testing their herds. But yeah, yet to be confirmed, but definitely in our minds at the moment. So I guess I'll finish by saying that I think as long as we can maintain a good level of engagement with Scotland's cattle keepers, I think we will reach the endpoint of BVD eradication. And so I'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening.